He was a champion of freedom who changed the world.
In the name of the heroic struggle of our people.
Tonight, the world reacts to the death of Nelson Mandela at the age of 95.
He is now at peace.
On our broadcast tonight, remembering the man and his legacy. Nightly News begins now.
The death of Nelson Mandela. From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. For millions who loved him in the modern country he formed and around the world, he was the hope and the light of the world. Nelson Mandela has died at the age of 95. While this announcement was inevitable, it has still come as a shock to the world with the realization that a beacon of freedom and moral authority and dignity and forgiveness is now gone. A former prisoner turned Nobel laureate, for so many years a living symbol of peace. Late today, local time in South Africa, after visible activity and worry outside the Mandela home, South African President Zuma went on live television and broke the sad news to his country.
Fellow South Africans, our beloved Nelson Mandela, the founding president of our democratic nation, has departed.
President Zuma's announcement was followed within the hour by President Obama from the White House.
To deny any person their human rights.
We've lost one of the most influential, courageous, and profoundly good human beings that any of us will share time with on this earth. He no longer belongs to us. He belongs to the ages.
Part of an emotional appearance late today by President Obama in the White House briefing room. NBC News correspondent Rohit Kachru, who is based in South Africa, was outside the Mandela home when the news broke and remains there tonight. And Rohit, all night tonight we have seen video of people gathering to sing and celebrate the life of Nelson Mandela. While it's important to remember, a lot of South Africans are still going to wake up to the sad news in the morning.
That's right, Brian. It is incredibly early in the morning here, almost 2 o'clock, and many South Africans haven't heard the news yet, but a few hundred of those who have came down here to Nelson Mandela's home immediately. They have gathered around us. They are singing songs from the anti-apartheid struggle, singing the national anthem in all of its 12 languages, this multicultural, multiracial musical celebration of the Rainbow Nation. And one of the fascinating observations here is how young people are. Like South Africa itself, this crowd is young. The people here in the main have no memory of apartheid, but such is the legacy of Nelson Mandela that he means almost as much to the youngsters who are standing around me as people who lived through the darkest years of apartheid. Earlier this evening, 4 hours ago, President Zuma broke the news to the nation and broke the hearts of millions of South Africans, because although this news was entirely predictable, a 95-year-old man with a serious respiratory illness who has been in hospital and receiving high intensive care at home for 6 months, you know, it was predictable that he would at some point pass away, but nevertheless, it was still incredibly painful, perhaps the most mournful, the most sorrowful day in the history of modern South Africa. The father of the nation, the man who gave black South Africans the vote, freedom, dignity and liberty, and who gave white South Africans a secure and relatively safe future in modern South Africa. Well, he's being mourned today. Nelson Mandela dead, Brian, at the age of 95.
Rohit Kachru in suburban Johannesburg tonight. Rohit, thank you. And NBC News special correspondent Charlene Hunter-Gault has lived for many years in South Africa as a journalist and as a citizen is among those best able to talk about Nelson Mandela's life and legacy. And Charlene, while it's just been hours since we heard the news, Rohit is right. We've had a long time to prepare for this moment. What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, in South Africa, people rarely use the word death or dying. They talk about transitioning. And I think that that spirit that you're hearing outside of Nelson Mandela's home is really a part of that notion that Nelson Mandela has transitioned to a different place. And I think you know, we almost think of him as a superhuman person. And I've thought over these months since we were there in South Africa when he first went to the hospital, that over these weeks and months, in his own sort of wisdom, he's been preparing his nation and the world for this. And I think that one of the things that surely will happen in the immediate aftermath of his passing will be South Africans coming together as Nelson Mandela wanted them to come together. I would suspect that when those who are not outside singing tonight but will wake up and hear the news will be sad for a moment, but it will bring the nation together, sort of like the soccer matches did when the country hosted the World Soccer Cup a few years ago. And I guess the one hope that one would have is that these remembrances of Mandela will make a difference in his country today, because he so much wanted his country to be united.
Charlene, we're going to join you in hoping for exactly that as dawn breaks across South Africa. Charlene Hunter-Gault with us tonight from Washington. Let's take a moment here and look back at this life in the public realm, at least, that, remember, started as a fighter against apartheid, then as a prisoner of the system, and next as president. Nelson Mandela lived a truly remarkable life.
To deny any person their human rights is to challenge their very humanity.
Nelson Mandela called his life a long walk to freedom, a struggle to end South Africa's racist system of apartheid. As a young lawyer and activist, he initially advocated peaceful resistance until the 1960 Sharpeville massacre.
The police fired point blank into the crowd.
South African police killed scores of anti-apartheid demonstrators. For Nelson Mandela, it was a turning point.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
Mandela's African National Congress, the ANC, was banned. He became an outlaw, but he refused to back down. Arrested in 1962, Mandela was charged with sabotage and with attempting to violently overthrow the government. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. For years, for decades, the struggle for justice in South Africa continued, with the imprisoned Nelson Mandela as its symbol. At times, he was forced to break rocks in the hot sun for hours at a time. The government offered Mandela freedom if he would renounce violence. He refused.
Today marks the 25th year behind bars for Nelson Mandela.
South Africa became an international outcast, facing sanctions, boycotts, and growing political pressure.
Nelson Mandela should be released to participate in the country's political process.
Rock concerts for the cause were broadcast around the world. In 1989, South Africa's hardline president P.W. Botha resigned, replaced by F.W. de Klerk, who slowly began to dismantle apartheid. The ban on the ANC was lifted, and on February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked to freedom.
Nelson Mandela, free at last and back among his people.
I greet you all in the name of peace.
27 years in prison had not weakened Mandela's resolve.
The armed struggle will go on as long as the government has not responded to our satisfaction.
But he also urged restraint, even forgiveness, telling blacks to, quote, throw their guns into the sea, and reassuring anxious whites.
Whites are fellow South Africans, and we want them to feel safe.
Mandela's courage and sacrifice were recognized around the world. In America, he was welcomed as a hero. Mandela and de Klerk were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1993. The following year, in the first mixed-race election in South Africa's history, Nelson Mandela was elected president.
Today is a day like no other before it.
We were the first to interview him on that first morning as president-elect. Mandela tempered South Africa's joy when he said healing his country would take time.
It cannot be done overnight. It is going to take a year, 2 years, even as much as 5 years.
So help me God.
From enemy of the state to head of state, Nelson Mandela's walk to freedom became a journey shared by his entire nation.
I have never been so excited and hopeful in my life in South Africa as I am now.
Years later, Nelson Mandela paid a return visit to his former prison cell, this time accompanied by President Bill Clinton, who later presented him with the Congressional Gold Medal. Mandela stepped down as president in 1999, but he lived long enough to see the United States elect its own first black president.
So help me God.
And in 2011, he was paid a visit in South Africa by First Lady Michelle Obama, who brought along first daughters Malia and Sasha. Admired around the world and revered at home, Nelson Mandela's South Africa embraced a multiracial future and re-entered the family of nations. He leaves a legacy of freedom and proof that one life can make a difference.
We are one country. We are one people.
And we are happy to be joined here in the studio tonight by Nelson Mandela's biographer. Rick Stengel is a veteran journalist, former managing editor of Time magazine, who during his time chronicling the life of Nelson Mandela from more than one book, actually lived with him. He wrote about his time with Mandela in the book Mandela's Way. In fact, Mandela is godfather to your oldest son, Rick, and my favorite Rick Stengel quote to start off this conversation. You and I have known this day was coming, of course, for 20 years or more. The last pure hero on the planet.
Brian, he is indeed the last pure hero, but if he were here to talk to us, he would say that he wasn't a hero in the conventional sense. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a philosopher. He was a pragmatic politician. And there's a lesson for all of us in that he had one great goal, bringing freedom to his people. But whatever way took him there, he would use it. And that's why he was ultimately a pragmatist and a politician.
In that first interview back in '94, we saw pictures of it. I sat down with him and said, "What's your goal immediately for the people of Soweto?" I was stunned. He said, "Regular trash pickup." And that's the local pragmatic politician in him.
Well, he would always, I remember it fondly, when we were out walking and he would meet a young boy, the question he would ask him is, "What did you have for breakfast today?" He wanted to make sure that there was prosperity for his people as well as freedom, and that freedom would bring prosperity. He was a very practical, hard-headed politician.
Talk about your personal time with him, because, of course, it was years of your life, and you always said he made you walk a little taller.
Well, I had to have Nelson Mandela in my head, which is a wonderful thing for anybody, and unfortunately he isn't quite there as prominently as he once was. But to think about things the way he did, with moderation, with caution, with understanding. I mean, that's what made him a great leader, is that he listened to people. He wasn't doctrinaire. And he did, in fact, avert what might have been the greatest civil war we would have seen in the 20th century.
Go back, I don't know, the last 100 years of public life. He doesn't compare to a Roosevelt or an FDR or a Woodrow Wilson, but where does he rank among the great public figures and game changers?
You know, Brian, the person I liken him to is George Washington. He was the father of his country. He was the person who, like George Washington, stepped down willingly. African leaders don't do that. They often leave office horizontally. He stepped down after one term. He said he didn't want to be an octogenarian president. That set the path, a path for Africa that had never been there before. So he's a man of the ages.
And finally, as we watch this period of mourning, what should we know about modern South Africa? Such a young country, but they had such a relationship with him, often calling him father, often saying about old age, it's time for him to rest.
Yes, and what people don't realize, it's a very young country, so the majority of people never really experienced Nelson Mandela as a leader. But the legacy of bringing people together, the legacy of bridging black and white, the legacy of bringing old and new is something that should live on for them. And I think it's a very hopeful time for them, and should be, and it is the Rainbow Nation, as he called it.
Rick Stengel, the biographer of Nelson Mandela, a joy to have you here tonight as we remember this towering life. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll take a break. We'll have much more coming up on the passing of Nelson Mandela. Up next, Tom Brokaw, who, of course, covered Nelson Mandela's long fight for freedom, will be with us next with his thoughts. And later, some of the day's other news, including a big and dangerous weather system moving across our country as the news marches on. That's a live picture of the marquee at the Apollo Theater in Harlem tonight, where they quickly changed the lettering outside in remembrance of Nelson Mandela after the word started to spread today of his death at the age of 95. As promised, we're joined here in the studio by Tom Brokaw. After all, when you look at the public life and legacy of Nelson Mandela, you're fortunate enough, so much of it happened on your watch. I was thinking today of our trip in '94. To cover his eventual election as president. But mostly American viewers were glued to the live coverage in 1990, The Long Walk to Freedom.
Well, I got a call on a Tuesday morning from a friend of mine in the South African government, said, you better come right away. And I said, I need more than that. It's a long way. And he called back and said, get on the airplane. Went there. It didn't look like they were going to release him. Remember, we had not seen him in 27 years. Right. And then, of course, he was released. And we didn't know what he would look like. We had that one black and white grainy photograph. And this is me in the backyard with him. And it turns out he looked like he'd been on a 3-day holiday somewhere. And a lot of the people who were in prison with him, and I think this is really important, said that they used those years to talk with each other about their philosophy, about their strategy once they did get out. So he was absolutely prepared now to take his place, not only in his government, but on the world stage. We often talk about leaders have to wait the history of judgment. In his case, he's a great man, and he has changed not only his country, but the perception of race and leadership and the philosophy of pulling together people who have been in conflict with each other for more than 100 years, Brian.
I know people who use the expression in a flip manner. You'll ask them how they're doing. They'll say, well, it sure beats breaking rocks in the hot sun.
Yeah.
Think about it. For 18 years, part of his 27 years incarceration, he broke rocks in the hot sun. As a practical matter, never regained his vision fully.
One of the most poignant stories that I heard was that he was called from his cell one day by the warden. And they all watched him go to the warden's office and come back and not speak to them, go into his cell and lie down and not say anything for the next 12 hours. His son had been killed that day. Now, can you imagine?
No.
There was nothing that he could do. There was no communication he could have with him. But he went about the business of staying alive and surviving and staying in touch with his colleagues. And when he came out, all he had to do was raise his hand, and he could have started a race war. But he didn't do that. And as Rick Stengel said, he served one term and said it's time for others to go on. After he left office, he would come to New York often. He was the most gregarious, sociable kind of guy you can possibly imagine. He was here not too long after Bill Clinton had some difficulties with personal deportment, and he was telling everybody could kind of calm down about all this. We've got to keep moving in this country and the world.
We've lost a towering figure. Tom, thanks for helping us remember Nelson Mandela.
My pleasure. It was a great, of all the things I got to do, being with him the morning after, Brian, was one I'll never forget.
Absolutely. Tom, thanks. Another break. We're back in a moment with some of the other news of this day. As we said, there is other news to talk about tonight. We had a whole broadcast full of it planned before the urgent news arrived from South Africa. And a lot of the news is weather, specifically an ice storm in the middle of the country. The National Weather Service fears could be catastrophic. Weather Channel meteorologist Jim Cantori is with us tonight from Dallas, where they are witnessing a 50-degree drop in temperatures over 24 hours. Jim, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Yeah, these 80s early on are helping us right now a little bit in North Dallas, but that won't be the situation for the rest of the night and tomorrow morning, where this place could be complete gridlock. Let's talk about this because it is a far-reaching storm where 7/8 of the country is going to be in the deep freeze along with this ice. Let's start you off with Friday. Look at this area covered by ice. Dallas, Little Rock, Louisville, up in through Pittsburgh as well. And we're talking about a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch of ice here. On Saturday, that precipitation moves into the northeast, where even the coastal cities could start as snow and sleet. And then on Sunday, some of these same areas, Brian, that got the sleet will get it again in the form of freezing rain. So power outages and cold for the next several days.
All right, Jim Cantore in Dallas. We will stay on it with you, Jim. Thanks. Fast food workers across this country held protest rallies today in some 100 cities, demanding a raise in the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 an hour. A raise the restaurant industry, for one, says would mean higher prices and fewer jobs. What many people may not realize is that taxpayers are footing some of the bill for low wages. More than half of fast food workers, half of them rely on some form of public assistance currently, like food stamps. Another break. Our coverage continues right after this.
The death of Nelson Mandela. This is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
And as promised, special greetings to those of you joining us watching on our NBC stations. We're back with more of our special coverage of the passing of Nelson Mandela, who died today at the age of 95. As you might imagine, at this hour, reaction to his loss is pouring in from around the world, and the nation of South Africa now begins a state of mourning. Our South African-based correspondent Rohit Katru is with us from outside the Mandela family home in Johannesburg. Rohit, as we said in our first half hour, this is a nation, many of whom went to bed last night, who will be waking up tomorrow morning to hear this anticipated but still sad and shocking news.
Absolutely right, Brian. Anticipated, expected, predictable, but painful nonetheless. And as I look around, the crowds here have grown to maybe 400 or 500 people, mainly South Africans who were born after the birth of democracy, the so-called born frees who have no memory of the darkest years of apartheid. And there is no one among this crowd who is crying. They're all singing and celebrating his life rather than mourning his death, because of course his death was not in any way surprising, coming almost 6 months to the day since he was admitted to hospital with a very serious respiratory illness. People here celebrating his life, the life of the man that perhaps the world most respects and most reveres, but a man who said himself that I am not a saint, but a sinner who keeps on trying. But nevertheless, there is perhaps no one in this world who in the modern age has been more revered and more respected. And because of that, because of what he gave South Africans, because of the free nation that was born under his presidency, people are coming out onto the streets and singing and cheering loudly, but not a single person here is crying. This is a celebration of Nelson Mandela's life. Nelson Mandela dead now at the age of 95, Brian.
Rohit Katru starting us off from outside the family home in suburban Joburg. Rohit, thank you very much. And again, we go to NBC News special correspondent Charlene Hunter-Gault. And Charlene, exactly what you said in the first half hour coming true on that suburban street in Johannesburg. As Rohit said, no one is crying. Talk about the paternal hold this man had on the population and now the celebration of his life.
Well, he's the most beloved man in the world, and especially in South Africa, even among those young people out there who are called born frees. They were born after the end of apartheid. And many of them, like our born frees here in America, who don't remember much about the civil rights movement. They don't remember much about his life, but they know what he stood for. And I think that, you know, today in South Africa, even when people wake up in the morning, because most people don't even know he's transitioned, and I use that word because in South Africa, people don't talk about death and dying. They talk about transitioning, and it's a happy time. And I'm sure they're going to be celebrating his life. And I hope they will be teaching what Nelson Mandela stood for. This is a moment to teach. It's a teachable moment as much as it is a moment to reflect and think about what Nelson Mandela has meant to the world and to these young people who can sing in that neighborhood where they used to not even be able to go without a pass, the black ones. And it's that kind of thing that Nelson Mandela did away with that we need to remember. Those young people could not have gone into that neighborhood at this time of night without a pass before Nelson Mandela and his people liberated the country. So that's what they're, representing now.
And Charlene, how far back did your life and knowledge of Nelson Mandela go?
Well, I first went to South Africa in 1985, and I snuck around to look at the prison where he was being held. But I also talked to people on both sides when it was the darkest time, when the white minority was still insisting on supremacy. And then I first met Mandela 4 or 5 days after he got out of prison in his backyard, and he was just wonderful. And when I told him, trying to get some simpatico between the two of us, that I came out of the civil rights movement, the first thing he said to me was, "Oh, did you know Miss Maya Angelou?" He said, "We used to read her in prison." And I couldn't wait to get back to America and tell Maya Angelou that she was an inspiration for Nelson Mandela in prison.
Part of the arc of an extraordinary life in public. Charlene, thank you very much for being with us tonight and helping us to remember. As we said, reaction to the news of Mandela's death pouring in from around the globe. Our chief foreign affairs correspondent, Andrea Mitchell, tracking all of it tonight from our Washington bureau. And Andrea, what a public life.
What a public life, and the measure of the man, the measure of his influence, his life, is how the world reacted tonight. He transformed his world and ours, inspiring millions, including presidents and future kings. Tweeting a favorite picture, Bill Clinton wrote, "I will never forget my friend Madiba," using the affectionate name by which he was known to his followers. Prince William and his wife, the Duchess of Cambridge, were at tonight's London premiere for the film made from Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom.
Extremely sad and tragic news. We're just reminded what an extraordinary and inspiring man Nelson Mandela was. And my thoughts and prayers are with him and his family right now.
And tonight, Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron.
Tonight, one of the brightest lights of our world has gone out. Nelson Mandela was not just a hero of our time, but a hero of all time.
President Bush 41 wrote, "As president, I watched in wonder as Nelson Mandela had the remarkable capacity to forgive his jailers, setting a powerful example of redemption and grace for us all." President George W. Bush wrote, "President Mandela was one of the great forces for freedom and equality of our time. Mandela had set an example by visiting New Zealand, forgiving the country that had sent its rugby teams to play South Africa during the apartheid years, as portrayed in the film Invictus." Tonight, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, John Key, wrote, "Mr. Mandela was a force for change not only in South Africa, but around the world." Reacting tonight, Muhammad Ali wrote, "His was a spirit born free, destined to soar above the rainbows. Today his spirit is soaring through the heavens. He is now forever free." New York's Cardinal Dolan wrote, "Nelson Mandela was a hero to the world. His bravery in defending human rights against the great evil of apartheid made him a symbol of courage and dignity, as well as an inspiration to people everywhere." And Mandela's great friend, Archbishop Desmond Tutu's foundation wrote in his name, "His fearless generosity and leadership were in the service of transcending our differences by seeking our oneness as human beings." And here is the New Yorker magazine cover, a tribute to the young Mandela, the young freedom fighter. And tonight, Bono, Mandela's great supporter and friend, wrote, "In the end, Nelson Mandela showed us how to love rather than hate, not because he had never surrendered to rage or violence, but because he learned that love would do a better job." Brian.
Andrea Mitchell in our D.C. bureau tonight. Andrea, thanks. And continuing this theme, after a break, we will hear some personal reflections from President Obama. We are back with more of our coverage of the passing late today of Nelson Mandela at the age of 95, as we've been saying all evening long. Reaction is pouring in, including some emotional comments from President Obama delivered in the briefing room in the White House West Wing. For more on that, our chief White House correspondent Chuck Todd is standing by on the North Lawn tonight. And Chuck, when you look at the timeline, Nelson Mandela kind of strings together so many American presidents from the modern era.
He does, sort of passing the baton. But there's something about the connection that President Obama himself feels with Nelson Mandela. It's something that he shared tonight in a very powerful and poignant statement.
I am one of the countless millions who drew inspiration from Nelson Mandela's life. My very first political action, the first thing I ever did that involved an issue or a policy or politics, was a protest against apartheid. I would study his words and his writings. The day he was released from prison gave me a sense of what human beings can do when they're guided by their hopes and not by their fears. And like so many around the globe, I cannot fully imagine my own life without the example that Nelson Mandela set. And so long as I live, I will do what I can to learn from him.
Since the president learned of the news, Brian, and we can show the White House released this photo, the president himself has been watching all the coverage, sort of ingesting it and digesting it, frankly, the way a lot of us are today, as a way to remember Nelson Mandela.
Chuck Todd from the White House for us tonight. Chuck, thanks. And we're happy that once again we are joined by Nelson Mandela's biographer, Rick Stengel, veteran journalist, as we said, former managing editor of Time magazine, who had the great privilege of living with Nelson Mandela and compiling both books. And we see the Time magazine cover story, this being Thursday night, you being the former boss at Time. In the parlance of magazines, I guess they crashed an issue.
Well, we had that, it was already done, and we knew this day was coming, and Nancy Gibbs, the editor of Time, had it ready, and I'd written my piece a long time ago, and it's a beautiful, great collection, and that's one of my very favorite pictures of him, that picture on the cover.
I was looking back at some of the single-word quotes you've used over the years to describe this man. Meticulous, a power charmer, stubborn, golden, luminous. You've also cautioned, though, about use of the word saint. And it's not too early in our remembrance to point out, especially to the generation that came up after his story was well known, that his organization, the ANC, was not a nonviolent organization. It was rough, and he surrounded himself with some rough people.
Right. He started out being nonviolent. And when he realized that the ANC wasn't getting anywhere close to its mission, the group of leaders of the ANC decided we need to become a military organization. And he started Umkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, which was the military wing of the ANC. And he taught himself. He read generals. He read Sun Tzu. He read Caesar. He learned that like he learned everything. And it went against his grain. But again, as I was saying before, he had one overarching goal. And whatever got to that goal, he would do, even embracing violence. And as you showed earlier, he refused to not embrace violence to get out of prison, because he said, I can't negotiate while I'm in prison. And that was the leverage that he had, and he understood that.
When you're in South Africa, as you know better than most, you don't hear Mandela as much as you hear Madiba, his clan name. And as I was saying to Charlene, it's parental, it's paternal, this relationship, even with the born-free generation. It's hard to describe.
Yes, you know, it's one of the things that I've always thought that people don't quite understand about him, and one of the paradoxes is he's a revolutionary, he was a socialist, but he also embraced that historical tradition of Africa. He was the son of a headman who was appointed by the white overseers. When his father died, he was raised by the king of the Tembu. He had this aristocratic royal upbringing, and he loved that. Even when the ANC wanted to get rid of any kind of tribalism, as it was called, he said, no, we have to embrace the traditional leaders, and he always did. He had this great fundamental duality about him, which is what made him so large and so wonderful.
Rick Stengel, the biographer of Nelson Mandela, you've helped us so much here in our effort to look back and remember this towering figure. Thank you for being here with us. Another look at the day's other news right after this break. Again, full disclosure here, before the news broke from South Africa, we had a whole broadcast full of news for tonight. There's no shortage of it, starting with what the National Weather Service fears could be a catastrophic weather event right on through the center of the country. Some places could get sustained icing of upwards of 12 to 18 hours. That'll mean power outages in the cold weather. NBC meteorologist Dylan Dreyer is in Fort Smith, Arkansas, between Little Rock and Tulsa. And Dylan, what can you tell us from there?
Good evening, Brian. You know, we have had freezing rain here since 9 a.m. and we still have several more hours to go. It's actually coming down very hard right now. We are expecting at least a ½ an inch of ice developing from Texas to Tennessee, with possibly an inch of ice in Oklahoma and here in Arkansas. This is the type of ice that coats everything, the trees and the power lines, and we could end up with tens of thousands without power. Roads could become impassable as the ice glazes them later on tonight. And unfortunately, another storm system is coming into the same area on Sunday. Brian?
Dylan Dreyer, thank you very much for that. The other major story we'd prepared to be covering today, we mentioned this in our first half hour, the protest by fast food workers in dozens of American cities demanding the federal minimum wage be raised to $15 an hour. Our report from Joe Fryer in Los Angeles.
Make our wages superside. Fast food workers walked off the job today pushing for the first federal minimum wage increase in 4 years.
Fast food workers run this town. Get up, get down.
They braved frigid temps in Denver.
We can't survive on 725.
And rainy weather in Atlanta, while protesters in other cities simply moved their chants inside.
It's catching like wildfire all throughout the country. Nobody's ever really seen anything like this.
Fanny Velasquez skipped her early morning shift at a McDonald's in Los Angeles. Are you nervous at all about not showing up to work this morning?
Yes, I was nervous.
She lives with her parents and supports 3 children. About 25% of all fast food workers are raising kids.
Sometimes they ask me, Mom, can you buy me this? And I'm like, I don't have enough money.
Nija Pretzer works at Dunkin' Donuts in Tampa. Like 52% of fast food workers, she relies on some kind of public assistance.
I work hard. When I get my paycheck at the end of the week, it's just not enough to survive, and it's kind of like an insult.
McDonald's employee Simon Rojas says he's a trained pharmacy technician but can't find a job in his field. At 23 years old, half of fast food workers today are his age or older.
I'm glad I have a job, but $8 is not cutting it.
That $8 wage generates a salary of barely $17,000 a year. As for today's protesters, many were not fast food workers. Some were even bussed in by labor groups, drawing criticism.
The activities today are really kind of made for TV protests.
The fast food industry argues a $15 wage is too high.
Prices would have to go up and less jobs would be created.
In a statement, McDonald's says we respect the right to voice an opinion. Some customers would pay more to help workers.
They deserve it, man.
But as this man pulled away, he told us $15 might be too much, a sign this food fight might not be fast. Joe Fryer, NBC News, Los Angeles.
And when we come back, a conversation I had with Nelson Mandela almost 20 years ago on one of the signature days of his extraordinary life. Let's take you back to the scene. This is live, what's now early Friday morning, suburban Johannesburg. The crowd outside Nelson Mandela's house, as you heard, no crying, but a big celebration of his life. We now want to take you back almost 20 years to an April morning in 1994 in a hotel suite in Johannesburg. Nelson Mandela had been elected president the night before, and I had the honor of being the first Western journalist that day to shake his hand and sit down and talk with him. Mandela showed no bitterness or anger. He was famous for that. No thought of revenge. When I asked him about his predecessor, F.W. de Klerk, the man he defeated, he spoke only of reconciliation and working together.
Our relations with Mr. de Klerk are fairly good. And he is one of those South Africans I hold in high regard. We have had the sharp differences. We have quarreled. We have said cruel things against each other. But at the end of the day, we are able to shake hands and to think of the interests of South Africa. And he has had an experience which I have not had. And if my organization comes out with a majority in these elections, I will have to depend very much on his support, his experience.
What happens when Nelson Mandela has to use force against elements of South Africa's black community? Are you willing and able to take on the political pressures that will take place?
I don't expect that a government of national unity, as well as succeeding governments, will rely as a solution on force. We depend on the people. We depend on persuasion. And I don't visualize any period when we will have to use force.
Let's talk about this word, expectation. It has become almost an expression, something you hear throughout your country, and that is that the blacks expect a new car and a new home the day after the election, and the whites expect to lose everything they have, the status quo. How do you control the game of expectations on both sides?
The fear and the concern by the whites and other minorities is genuine, and it is our task to address them. But you must understand that in order to deliver the goods in this regard, it cannot be done overnight. It is going to take a year, 2 years, even as much as 5 years. The important thing is that after the results have been announced, the process of mobilizing the country and its resources to address these problems will start.
That was April of '94. Mandela dead today at the age of 95. Thank you for being with us for our extended broadcast tonight. Good night.